Tonight at 10, chaos in Downing Street as 4 of the most senior advisors to Boris Johnson leave Number 10. They include one of his longest-serving members of staff, Munira Mirza, quitting over the Prime Minister's Jimmy Savile attack on Keir Starmer. The Chancellor has also distanced himself from those comments.
Being honest, I wouldn't have said it, and I'm glad that the Prime Minister clarified what he meant.
The other aides stepping down are all linked to the controversy over lockdown parties in Downing Street.
Losing his staff or losing his way? We're live in Westminster on a night of turmoil for Number 10.
Also tonight, a huge rise in energy bills from April as the government sets out plans to help with the rising cost of living. Northern Ireland's devolved government in turmoil after the First Minister quits, angry over post-Brexit trading arrangements. Ahead of Beijing's Winter Olympics, the tight restrictions on ordinary people in China. And Sir Kenneth Branagh's memoir of childhood, Belfast, gets 6 nominations for this year's BAFTAs.
And coming up in the sport on the BBC News Channel, more changes for England cricket. Head coach Chris Silverwood leaves the men's side following their heavy Ashes defeat in Australia.
Good evening. There's chaos tonight at Number 10 with 4 of Boris Johnson's most senior advisors leaving their jobs. They were part of his inner circle, with one of his longest-serving members of staff, Munira Mirza, the head of policy, resigning after criticising him for implying Sir Keir Starmer, a former director of public prosecutions, was personally responsible for allowing Jimmy Savile to escape justice for sexually abusing children. Tonight, the 3 other aides who are stepping down, Jack Doyle as Director of Communications, Chief of Staff Dan Rosenfield and Mr Johnson's Principal Private Secretary Martin Reynolds, have all been implicated in the controversy over lockdown parties. With the very latest developments, here's our political editor, Laura Koonsberg, and a warning: this film contains flashing images.
Boris Johnson managed to keep a Blackpool tram on track today. Yet it's not clear tonight where his leadership is really going. That went well, thank God for that, the Prime Minister said. He might need prayers to create a sense of stability in his government, though. The Communications Director, Jack Doyle, walked out of his job tonight. A major role in any Number 10, but the message had gone badly wrong. The Chief of Staff, Dan Rosenfield, who was brought in to create order, is on his bike and going too. The third exit, Martin Reynolds, the Prime Minister's senior civil servant, who invited around 100 people to a garden party. And the explosive fourth exit, his friend and political confidant of more than 10 years, Munira Mirza, chief of AIDES, Boris's brain, one former colleague told me. She's not just gone, but has left dynamite in her wake, slamming the Prime Minister's comments linking the leader of the opposition to Jimmy Savile early this week. She wrote it was an inappropriate and partisan reference to a horrendous case of child sex abuse, adding, "Despite my urging, you did not apologise for the misleading impression you gave." This is what he'd managed to say.
I'm talking not about the leader of the opposition's personal record when he was DPP, and I totally understand that he had nothing to do personally with those decisions. I was making a point about his responsibility for the organisation.
Not an apology for the false claim he originally made on Monday.
This leader of the opposition, a former Director of Public Prosecutions, Mr Speaker, so he spent most of his time prosecuting journalists and failing to prosecute Jimmy Savile, as far as I can make out, Mr Speaker.
An untrue allegation that appalled victims and some MPs on the Prime Minister's own side. Keir Starmer was the boss of the Crown Prosecution Service when Jimmy Savile was not charged. But Sir Keir had no individual involvement in the case. And unusually, the Chancellor was happy to show a public split.
Being honest, I wouldn't have said it, and I'm glad that the Prime Minister clarified what he meant.
Who, as well as grappling with the economy, is grappling with the government's reputation.
Hi Laura, how are you?
He lives and works under the same roof where lockdown gatherings took place.
For the record, Chancellor, you knew of nothing of any of these gatherings, even one that happened outside that window. You knew nothing.
As I said, people think I'm standing out here looking outside that window. I spent half my time in the Treasury as well as working here. But what I was focused on at that time, as were many people, is making sure that we could help the country through a period of enormous anxiety.
You walked into the cabinet room at the end of Boris Johnson's birthday celebration. Did that not happen?
You were asking me about something that happened over 2 years ago, and I walked into a meeting with a group of people, as I do all the time.
Do you worry, though, that this has damaged the public's confidence in the government that you're part of?
Yes, I think it has, and I can appreciate people's frustration, and I think it's now the job of all of us in government, all politicians, to restore people's trust.
Some of your colleagues want the Prime Minister to go. If that were to happen, would you run to replace him?
No, that's not what I'm focused on, and of course...
It's not my question. Would you do it?
No,
some of your colleagues want you to.
Well, that's very kind of them to suggest that, but what I think people want from me and what your viewers will want from me is to focus on my job. The Prime Minister has my full support.
But support for the bigger of this double act may not last forever. Chaotic days are one thing, a loss of credibility quite another.
So, Laura, the obvious question, where do all today's events and drama leave the Prime Minister?
Well, Clive, in a very, very tricky spot. A quartet of exits from Downing Street tonight. The Prime Minister's lost his Chief of Staff, his Policy Chief, the Chief of Communications and the senior civil servant who essentially ran his private office. Important to say, though, there are two different things going on. The first three, well, they were all people who in one way or another were deigned to have had some responsibility for the fiasco in recent weeks and months over allegations of lockdown parties behind Downing Street's front door. And Boris Johnson's allies will use that as evidence of saying, look, he gets it, he knows he has to change. That is a clear out that should mean that things should work better. Evidence that Boris Johnson really has understood that his party believes he has to pull his socks up. But that other departure, the dramatic exit of Munira Mirza, is an altogether different case. She is one of Boris Johnson's most long-standing political confidants, political allies, and is seen by some people as his brain, the person with ideas that have got him to where he is tonight. And she hasn't just gone, she made her reasons for their disagreement achingly public, chucking a grenade through the Downing Street door as she actually made her exit. And all of that adds up to even more of a sense of instability at a time when you already have some Conservative MPs having put their head above the parapet in recent days and calling publicly for him to quit. It's clear that Boris Johnson will absolutely try to fight to stay on, but right now, Clive, unstable and rocky doesn't begin to cover it.
OK, Laura, thank you. Laura Koonsberg there live at Westminster. The Chancellor has been setting out plans to help millions of people after the energy regulator, Ofgem, confirmed an increase in what suppliers can charge customers for their gas and electricity. From April, the average bill will rise by almost £700 a year. That's because the energy price cap, the cost for the average household in England, Scotland and Wales for energy if they're not on a fixed deal, has been increased to almost £2,000. The changes will affect around 22 million households. Adding to the rising cost of living, interest rates have doubled to 0.5% as the Bank of England tries to curb increasing prices, and inflation, which is the rate at which prices are rising, is expected to peak at more than 7% in April, well above the bank's target of 2%. With more details, here's our business editor, Simon Jack.
For households like Suzanne's, the news today on energy prices was every bit as bad as feared. From April, fuel bills will rocket and tighten one of the biggest squeezes on household incomes in decades.
It's worrying and difficult at a time when everything seems to be rising at the same time. And it's everything that you have to use, whether it be utilities, interest rates, petrol, food, everything's going up at the same time.
Suzanne pays just over £1,100 a year for her energy. From April, that will rise by over 50%. And for a household using an average amount of energy, the annual price cap will rise from £1,277 to £1,971, a rise of £693, nearly £60 a month.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Given the sheer size of the shock, the government felt it had little option but to provide some financial support.
For me to stand here and pretend we don't have to adjust to paying higher prices would be wrong and dishonest. But what we can do is take the sting out of a significant price shock for millions of families by making sure the increase in prices is smaller initially and spread over a longer period.
A rise of nearly £700 in average annual energy bills is a massive hit to household incomes. The Chancellor wants to try and soften it in two ways. First, in April, homes in council tax bands A to D, that's over 80% of households, will get a £150 rebate funded by central government. And then, in October, £200 will be knocked off everyone's bills, but that money will have to be repaid, £40 a year for the next 5 years. Now, the hope is that by then, the sky-high gas prices which have created this crisis may have fallen. But even the person who sets the price cap says that is far from certain. The head of Ofgem told the BBC there was no reason to think high prices would be short-lived.
It's very hard to predict energy prices at the moment, so the market is incredibly volatile. So it's very hard to say what will happen at the end of this year or early next year. But right now, we are not seeing signs that these prices are coming down.
Project we're looking at for this area.
Visiting a community centre in Bletchley today, the Labour leader thought the measures were inadequate.
It's a dodgy sort of buy now, pay later deal that doesn't come anywhere near meeting the cost or the increase in costs of energy bills. And it's really such a small response to a very, very big problem. And it's on the minds of so many people.
Gas, even when liquefied and carried in tankers like this, is the subject of a global bidding war, which could yet intensify. Precisely why even energy retailers say we must invest in alternatives.
The more we build UK energy independence through renewables, wind and solar, the cheaper our energy gets. Every windmill means we use less gas and we'll bring our prices down.
But here and now, energy prices are sucking money out of household incomes, government coffers and the economy as a whole. Simon Jack, BBC News.
Well, on top of all that, the Bank of England is warning that the cost of living is going to get worse, with inflation predicted to hit more than 7% in April, the highest rate for more than 30 years. However, the Governor, Andrew Bailey, has told the BBC that workers shouldn't ask for higher pay rises in order to help bring inflation under control. He's been speaking to our economics editor, Faisal Islam.
Prices rising everywhere, in our bills for food, in the price of used cars, and of course so much of it brought in on record shipments of tankers full of imported natural gas, piped straight into our bills. Today, the Bank of England forecasts that within weeks the rate of inflation will hit 7.25% before falling, driven by those energy price hikes. That's well above the Bank of England's target, the highest level in a generation. So today, the bank again raised interest rates to 0.5% to try to temper the rise in inflation. It is the second in what will be a series of rate rises this year, though rates remain low by pre-financial crisis standards. Those rate rises are having a real impact, for example, on Naomi Mellor trying to get a mortgage to buy a house, as incomes are generally squeezed.
It's been a long and drawn out process since last year, and it's looking likely that we're probably going to be ending up paying £100 to £200 a month more for a mortgage than we would have done prior to a rate rise. And when you couple that with rising energy bills, we've had a doubling of our energy bills in the last 3 months.
At the bank, what they're trying to do is stop expectations of rising prices becoming self-fulfilling, filtering longer term into prices and wages. They very nearly raised rates even higher today. Normally we get interest rate hikes like this to calm down a booming economy. The Bank of England's job is to take the drinks bowl away from the party. But there is no party here, nor in millions of households up and down the country. The Bank of England has lowered its forecast for the economy this year and next. And rising energy prices and food prices and taxes too are outweighing the rise in wages. This is a black day for living standards. The bank's forecasts showed that factoring in prices and taxes, the average take-home pay of households, which normally goes up, was going down by the largest amount since these figures began in 1990. And yet it is high rises in wages that the Bank of England is most concerned about.
What we can do is try to prevent inflation becoming more ingrained in the system.
So you're trying to get into people's heads and ask them not to ask for too high pay rises?
Well, broadly, yes. I would say that, in the sense of saying we do need to see moderation of wage rises. Now, that's painful.
An unusually blunt acknowledgement of tricky balancing acts for a bank trying to tame inflation and for households trying to make ends meet. Faisal Islam, BBC News.
And if you've got any queries on energy prices, then more information on the BBC News website. Just go to bbc.co.uk/news. Northern Ireland's First Minister Paul Givan of the Democratic Unionist Party has resigned over the implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol. Now, that's the mechanism governing the flow of goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland and was negotiated as part of the Brexit deal. Products crossing the Irish Sea into Northern Ireland are subject to new checks on entry, and this was meant to avoid the need for checks on goods reaching the Irish Republic. But unionists argue this effectively creates a border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. Mr Givan's resignation means the Deputy First Minister, Sinn Féin's Michelle O'Neill, loses her position. Here's our Ireland correspondent, Emma Vardy.
Political paralysis returns to Stormont. Something the DUP have been threatening since last year. Today, as the First Minister stepped down, it was delivered.
Our institutions are being tested once again, and the delicate balance created by the Belfast and St Andrews agreements has been impacted by the agreement made by the United Kingdom Government and the European Union, which created the Northern Ireland Protocol.
It means the power-sharing executive in Northern Ireland will cease to function. Decision-making affecting thousands of people's lives on hold. For some time, this storm has been on the horizon. The new border checks on goods which cross the Irish Sea represent for unionist parties a deep betrayal and a threat to their position in the UK. Last night, the DUP ordered civil servants to stop carrying out these checks, but there's disagreement over whether that order is lawful.
Well, ideally businesses, we don't want any checks on goods coming from Great Britain into Northern Ireland, and we really want minimal administration as well. What we are calling for is both the EU and the UK just to come to a negotiated outcome. We just hope that basically there's no rash reactions to this from either side.
This kind of political crisis is not new in Northern Ireland. When something similar happened in 2017, there was no government for 3 years. This time, different departments will continue to function, but what they can do will be limited.
For example, Northern Ireland's budget now can't be approved, meaning planning ahead for many public services will be on hold. What will happen with the remaining COVID restrictions is unclear, and a planned apology to victims of historical abuse is also now likely to be postponed.
It's very clear that there are catastrophic impacts in terms of the DUP's action today, and there are many, many casualties as a result of their political opportunism, not least the victims of historical institutional abuse.
This is being seen as a tactical move by the DUP in the run-up to the May elections. The Orange Order, which has significant influence, has been collecting tens of thousands of signatures from people opposing the Northern Ireland Protocol. And it's voters like this the DUP wants to keep on side. And that election the party has in its sights may now happen even earlier. Emma Vardy, BBC News, Belfast.
The government's latest coronavirus figures show more than 88,000 new cases were recorded in the latest 24-hour period. On average, 88,500 new cases were reported per day in the last week. The number of people in hospital with COVID has fallen to 14,816. There were 303 deaths, that's of people who died within 28 days of a positive test, though some will have died of other causes. On average, in the past week, 256 deaths were announced every day. Senior officials in Washington say the leader of the Islamic State group has been killed in a US Special Forces raid in northwestern Syria. Abu Ibrahim al-Hashimi al-Qureshi, who is one of the world's most wanted men. He died in a pre-dawn raid on a house in the Syrian village of Atma, just south of the Turkish border. He is understood to have blown himself up during the raid, in which 13 other people are thought to have died. The Scottish football club Raith Rovers has announced that the striker David Goodwillie won't be playing for them and that the club got it wrong in signing him in the first place. Goodwillie was the subject of a court ruling in a civil case 5 years ago that found he'd raped a woman. Our sports news correspondent Chris McLaughlin is in Kirkcaldy for us this evening. Chris, they admit they got it wrong then?
Yeah, for the past 5 years, Clive, David Goodwillie has been playing pretty successfully at Scottish League One side Clyde, but when he moved here to Raith Rovers earlier this week, it led to a furious backlash. Sponsors walked away, we had directors quitting, even the women's team cutting all ties. Everyone from the stadium announcer here to the First Minister have been talking about this. The club were initially digging their heels in, but today a U-turn and a pretty blunt statement from the chairman. We got it wrong, he said. We focused too much on footballing matters. We have all learned a hard and valuable lesson. Two things I think to take from this evening, Clive. Number one, David Goodwillie, found to be a rapist in a civil court, now is looking for another club. Will he be found? Will he find one? Will he be allowed to find one? And two, the people who brought him here are now desperately trying to prove to the people who walked away that they shouldn't be following him out of the door.
Chris, thanks for that. Chris McLaughlin there in Kirkcaldy. Two men and a teenage girl have been found guilty of murdering a doctor in a homophobic attack in a park in the centre of Cardiff. Jason Edwards, who's 25, 36-year-old Jason Strickland, and Dion Timms Williams, who was 16 at the time, killed Gary Jenkins in the city's Butte Park in July last year. They'll be sentenced next month. Polls have closed in the Southend West by-election in Essex. The seat became vacant after the death of the Conservative MP, Sir David Amess, who was stabbed during a constituency surgery last October. None of the main parties are challenging the Tory candidate. The result is expected sometime overnight. The 2022 Winter Olympics are getting underway in Beijing. Almost 3,000 athletes from 91 nations will compete, with over 100 gold medals on offer across 7 sports. The opening ceremony will take place tomorrow in the famous Bird's Nest National Stadium, with the curler Eve Muirhead and Dave Riding, who made history last month in Kitzbühel as the first British athlete to win an Alpine Skiing World Cup, sharing flag-bearing duties for Great Britain. But it's been a troubled build-up to the Games, with China dealing with the COVID pandemic and accusations of human rights abuses. Our China correspondent Robin Brandt has the very latest.
She is one of China's Olympians of tomorrow. Maybe. Yi hadn't even been born the first time the Olympics came to town. But now the 6-year-old skater is inspired by the Games.
It's very exhausting, but she presses on. She won't leave until she learns how to do all the moves. She doesn't quit.
She can't go to any of the events, though. She can't get close. The Winter Olympics is happening in Beijing, but almost everyone here is excluded from it.
China is in the middle of a renewed battle to try to maintain zero COVID in this country, and it's decided not to sell any tickets for the Games to members of the general public. So everyone who queues outside venues like this in the weeks ahead is going to be hand-picked, a member of the ruling Communist Party or someone who works at a government-controlled company.
It's not just COVID measures keeping people away. There's confrontation over China's human rights record. Senior officials from the US, the UK and more than a dozen other governments aren't coming to the ice rinks. The Olympics is just sport, though, say some looking on.
I think sports are sports and they shouldn't be messed with politics. The Games belong to everyone and we should all participate and watch. Politics is just politics.
This is the official slogan of the Games. And these children are singing about it in this propaganda video, released last month by the government in Xinjiang, the place where China denies it's committed genocide.
Pre-games period, I can feel it.
A former Olympian who's close to America's athletes this time told me why some of them are nervous about sharing this moment.
I don't think a single athlete is going to speak out at the games, and nor do I think they should. If I were there, I would be keeping my mouth shut because the risk is just too great. And this is really a failure of the International Olympic Committee. It's a failure of leadership that athletes are in this position.
China's leaders have promised to deliver an efficient, safe Olympic Games. But what is always a cold gathering feels much more frosty this time round. This is the Games defined by the big fissure on the world stage, with China on one side and the US on the other. And inside the bubble, athletes trying to get on with their sport. Robin Brandt, BBC News, Beijing.
Chris Silverwood has stepped down as the head coach of the England men's cricket team. It follows the 4-0 Ashes series defeat in Australia. An interim coach will be appointed to oversee next month's tour of the West Indies. This year's BAFTA nominations for the Film Awards have been announced. The sci-fi epic Dune leads the way with 11 nominations, including Best Film. But The Power of the Dog, a 1920s Western starring Benedict Cumberbatch, is also in the running for 8 awards. And Belfast, Sir Kenneth Branagh's semi-autobiographical coming-of-age film, has 6 nods. Our culture editor, Katie Razzle, is in Belfast, where she's been talking to one of the film's youngest stars.
Belfast is BAFTA's most garlanded British film, with 6 nominations, including for Best Film.
We all have a story to tell.
This story is Kenneth Branagh's, set in the city he grew up in.
When I grow up, I want to marry her.
Jude Hill plays 9-year-old Buddy, who's a fictionalised version of the young Ken, which could have been a challenge, but clearly worked out.
I don't think a lot of other 11-year-olds can say that Kenneth Branagh and Judi Dench and Ciarán Hinds are my best friends.
Some will see a snub in Kenneth Branagh missing out in the Best Director category. Ciarán Hinds wins a Best Supporting nomination, as does Katrina Balfe, in a film set against the backdrop of the Troubles.
I didn't know what they were, and a kid my age probably wouldn't know about them either unless their parents or grandparents were affected by the Troubles in any way.
So this city has its moment in the sun. For a film about the Troubles, yes, but through the eyes of a child more focused on family and love.
But it's sci-fi blockbuster Dune that has the highest number of nominations, 11.
I wonder what little lady made these.
Period Western The Power of the Dog has 8, including Best Actor for Benedict Cumberbatch and Best Director for Jane Campion. Half of BAFTA's directing nominees are women this year.
I have to say it's personally a real thrill to see so many women recognised across so many fields, and particularly, for example, in the Best Director category.
This BAFTAs aims to put rows over diversity behind it.
You gonna show them how dangerous you are?
Yes.
Will Smith is nominated for the first time ever in King Richard, but there are upsets too. Nothing for Olivia Colman, Nicole Kidman or Denzel Washington.
Why don't you and my mom act like brother and sister?
The youngest nominee is another 11-year-old Woody Norman for Best Supporting Actor in indie road movie Come On, Come On.
It was like the biggest rush when he said Woody Norman. So me and Mum just started screaming and jumping in the air. It was amazing.
As for this 11-year-old, he's just enjoying the ride.
If it ends up getting some Oscar nominations, what will your face look like then?
Probably the exact same they did when I found out that I got the role.
Katie Razzle, BBC News, Belfast.
That's it. Now on BBC One, time for the news where you are. Have a very good night.